think we got enough intro up. Let's get into this a little bit.
Yeah, so there's an exchange with Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, and I'm not actually sure who the guy was. I thought it was Ducey. It's some other person. But they're talking about whether or not we're in a recession, and it gets a little bit, starts sounding like an English class with what the definition of a recession is. And so here's this clip.
Next week's a very big week for the economy. So I read the CEA blog. Is the White House trying to change the common definition of a recession because next Thursday the GDP numbers coming out are going to show that we've been in a recession?
So let me say this, the strength of our labor market along with the other economic factors is what we generally see in a recession, or even what is not what we generally see in a recession or even a pre-recession, because we're seeing the strength of the economy and the labor market. So that's really important to note there, because those are key elements as we talk about that, as folks keep asking us about that. So Americans across the country are back to work at a historic level. 21 states, the most in history, have unemployment rates at or below 3%. That is an important number to note. 14 states are now at their lowest unemployment rates since this series began in 1976. And last month, the unemployment rate was a new low in 8 states. So again, the strength of our labor market, along with the economic indicators, is not what we generally see as we talk about recession or even pre-recession.
The growth of the job for the 3-month trend, the growth of job growth in the U.S. is shrinking, is decreasing, and 7.5 million people, a growing number, are multi-jobs, meaning they have to work more than one job to afford a living. So is jobs really a good indicator there?
Look,
I just want to jump in there and say I seem to recall when Bernie Sanders or even AOC was talking about people working multiple jobs, a lot of people were poo-pooing that as some sort of fantasy, but it's interesting when it gets deployed as the real actual problem and glaring sort of boil on American capitalism.
Here's what I would say. We've always talked about the strength of our economy. We've always talked about how historic it's been, and we've always talked about the transitioning, right? The transitioning to more stable and steady growth. And so to your point about the job growth there, this is what we have been kind of stating for the past several months. Look, the economy created 1.1 million jobs in the second quarter.
All right, so I think that's enough, David. What's your ruling on who's right on the semantic point and what the actual significance of this argument is?
Well, I'm just going to tell you all right now, I think we're going to title the segment something like both the Democrats and the Republicans are lying to you about the coming recession. And the reason for that is come on. We're all seeing indicators. People are feeling the stress and pressure in their lives right now that the state of the U.S. economy is not good. This is not something that is unique to the United States. It is something that's being felt across the globe. But certainly the Biden administration is doing very, very little materially to be supporting people in what looks like, a coming downturn. So these kind of nitpicking of job stats, and we're going to get later in the segment into a Marxist argument as to why that's actually a very sloppy indicator for looking at the moment that we're at in the business cycle. But why are they doing this? It's because they're worried about midterm messaging. And if we could pull up the kind of right-wing response as well, it's important to note this. This is one of those moments in American politics where things become very, very clear that neither of these two political organizations, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, is very interested in the actual experience and struggle that American people are facing.
This is what you were talking about?
Yeah.
So this guy, Jeffrey A. Tucker, he's longtime libertarian, was on Rand Paul's racist newsletter, produced those back in the day, which is from lore from 8 seasons. If we're like Dragon Ball Z right now, that was from Dragon Ball era politics. If some people follow that's out there. But yeah, Jeffrey Tucker says recession next. They'll tell us that it's misinformation, and yeah. So I'm curious. Jeremy Horpdahl here says that he's actually lying in this. Says that Jeffrey Tucker wrote an entire essay based on the false claim that the NBER changed definition of recession in 2020 away from 2 quarters of GDP decline to include more measures of the economy, such as employment. And he says they have never used the 2 quarters of GDP growth.
Mm-hmm. So like this is the point here is that you're like, and also this is not like an isolated example of a right winger making this argument. I believe Crenshaw has made this argument. Other people have been making this argument. Like all predictions, sir, the Joe Biden administration is going to change the definition of recession so that they don't get in trouble. And again, like this is exactly like, I mean, this is the kind of thing where you realize, not to sound like too much of a crank, like why corporate media is so awful, why so much of the discussions around these issues are so surface level, because the quibble here is about the official designation of what a recession is versus what it's not. So I'll just say right quick that it is correct to say that it's not true that the traditional definition of a recession is 2 contractions simultaneously in GDP. That's not true. But 2 contractions in GDP has happened in every recession. We've seen that, right? There have been recessions where we actually haven't had 2 contractions in GDP subsequently. But yes, typically that is a sign. But the official designation of a recession is done in this country by an organization called the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research. And they make that call using a host of different factors. And I don't even mean to malign the folks there, because a lot of them are very serious economists, smart folks who are doing, detailed analysis of the economy. Their definition, though, is fairly vague, right? Their definition is a significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and lasts for more than a few months. They look at, quote, real personal income minus transfer payments, non-farm payrolls, employment as gauged by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, household survey, real personal consumption expenditures, blah, 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 right? They look at a host of different factors to make this designation. So yes, the White House is finding a way to try to spin this by pointing to the fact that, there is a bit of an anomaly in the labor market, but we'll get to why that might be a bit of a false, signal that the economy is doing well. But I'll also note that, it's not just the Biden administration. Progressive economists like Dean Baker have also been cited in publications like the New York Times on CEPR as, pointing to job growth in the United States as a reason to say that much of this recession talk is early. So that's the conversation that if you turn on CNN, MSNBC, if you read opinion pieces in the New York Times, like that's what the fight is going to be about, which again is so cynical when we're talking about something that is significantly going to affect people's lives. Because look, it doesn't make one bit of difference to you what the NBER calls the moment that we're in. What matters to you is what your wages are like, if you're able to get food at the end of the month, if you have to use debt to finance your living in this country, right? And that paints a very, very stark picture. So I'm just going to put my cards on the table, that I'm not particularly worked up about what the official designation on this kind of thing is going to be. It's true, the liberals are right when they point out that like the right wing people are trying to nitpick and make it seem like some kind of statistical like there's some statistical subterfuge happening from the Biden administration. No, they're wrong. The NBR makes this designation on a whole host of factors, but it's also absolutely incorrect for the Biden administration to sort of be painting this picture like it's rosy. 2 just quick things on like the finality of this. Typically, we don't get that kind of designation like going into it. This is something that usually happens after the fact. They say, oh, we've been in a recession for this long, or we've been in a recession for that long, right? So it's not like a bell, like an emergency bell that like Biden needs to press and things start happening. This is a designation that's used for people who are engaged in corporate planning and things like that. And obviously, it's a very, very useful political, messaging tool to say, oh, Joe Biden gave us a recession because of his failed economic policies. And that's why they're worked up about this, because at the end of the day, the Democratic Party's worried about the midterms like they should be, because they've done very little for the American people. And the Republicans are trying to find ways to hit them on that. But neither of these organizations or people or groups care at all about the real, struggles that people are going through. And on the Democratic Party side, I just want to note, I don't want to make this all media criticism, but read some of the opinion pieces that have come out in the past few days on these kind of left liberal publications on this. It's all this, rah about some kind of anomalies in the economy, like the job market, to try and distract people from the reality that they're feeling and experiencing every day. And it just
Mhm.
shows how out of touch that party is with American workers, and that shouldn't be surprising. As Branko Marcetic, who was on the program recently, wrote in Jacobin a little while ago about a survey about membership in the Democratic and the Republican Party. White college educated voters are now making up a larger share of Democratic support than non-white voters for the first time in the survey's 6-year history. This contrasts with the pattern seen over most of the last few decades, in which the GOP tended to preserve its traditional advantage with white college graduates, while Democrats relied on the overwhelming support of non-white voters. So it's not surprising that the Democratic Party, their messaging isn't, bread and butter stuff on this. It's how can we find a way to sort of like hide the alarm bells from our voting bloc, which is insulated from some of the worst effects of what will be coming as we fall into a recession.
Yeah, and I don't trust the Democrats when they're like, "Oh, relax, workers are doing great," is because I think you see that as a problem, right? Like I think like we talk about the Fed raising rates, they did again today. I think announced another hike,
Mhm.
and that's meant to, I mean, put more tension into the system and squeeze people.
Ab- Absolutely. And like, I mean, this is one of the issues with, even talking about economics, in like a pure scientific way. Cause you noted early on about how like AOC, and I think it was AOC who said this and got in trouble, talking about how people are working 2, 3 jobs. Right. And everyone was like, well, actually that wouldn't be indicated on, unemployment statistics, which is true. But at the same time, are you really trying to paint over what that reality means for everyday people? Like
Right.
this is the kind of thing where it's like it's a messaging strategy and not a reality strategy for them.
Hmm.
And I think that this is why this moment is extremely dangerous. This is why a lot of people start tuning out politics, because they see this debate that like it seems like the stakes are high. We're talking about a recession. Recessions are bad, aren't they? And you see that it's like it's not even surface level. It's like symbolic level kind of stuff.
Right.
But if we could pull up this quote here from Michael Roberts, because I think he lays out a pretty strong argument here about why some of these job statistics may be misleading. And I'm going to read the full quote here, but we have the last bit towards the bottom. This is in a piece. We have a link in the show notes. We're trying to do that more often now on his excellent blog, The Next Recession. Little what is the word? He's ready to go in a lot of different circumstances with that URL. But energy, the recession trigger. Jane Hasius, chief U.S. economist at Goldman Sachs, said there is no doubt that a labor market slowdown is underway, adding that job openings and quits are declining, jobless claims are rising, the ISM employment indices in manufacturing and services have fallen to contractionary levels, and many public traded companies have announced hiring freezes or slowdown. That suggests that unemployment, this is from Michael Roberts, that suggests that unemployment is a lagging indicator in judging when a slump comes. Indeed, that would be in line with the Marxist analysis of slumps. First, profitability declines, particularly in the productive sector, then profits in total. This leads to a fall investment by companies and then in the laying off of labor and a reduction in wages. So the idea here that because we haven't seen effects in the labor market right away means that we're not falling into a recession is a bit backwards. And I think it's important to sort of re-up that Marxist theory of crisis, where it all starts in this tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And we've been seeing that squeeze. We've been talking about it on this program. We've been talking about it before the pandemic on TMBS, on the show in general, also on GEM. You're seeing in the bond markets, there is a squeeze in profitability across the board. And these things, they move down the line. If we could pull up the next bit, because like unless you wanted to do something on Meta, like we talked last week about fintech, and how they're getting hit very severely in their profits. Today, Meta formerly Facebook. I almost hate using whatever rebranding that they want to do. They're getting hit very, very hard as well in their profits. But of course, these are like these are the most speculative zombie kind of companies. They're fueled by cheap interest rates and speculation, and they're not as tied to the productive economy. I can't read that.
I just wanted to mention the Shopify story. It's a really great quote from Mr. Lutke, I believe this Tobias Lutke, the CEO of a Shopify. They cut 10% of staff. They placed some sort of bet on, it's tech bros speculating with venture capital. Ultimately, placing this bet was my call to make, and I got this wrong, he said in a memo. As a consequence, we have to say goodbye to some of you today, and I'm deeply sorry for that. So I got this wrong. We have to say goodbye to you, and it's just the way this is going to be a genre that we're going to watch as CEOs start laying off people. The way that they try to make them about them, like, oh, this is tough for me. I'm so sorry. What adjective can I put in front of sorry? As I say, like, we have to say goodbye to you. And by say goodbye, I mean, David and I have said goodbye to each other a number of times. None of us left that exchange without an income, right? That's a different kind of goodbye.
Yeah.
And like, it's just this, I mean, unbelievable, like, it's going to be dystopian with the way CEOs try to PR spin, throwing people out as the economy contracts.
And of course, so we're starting to see, the shaking going on in the most speculative industries. So obviously, Silicon Valley and all those boys are going to be hit hard. But let's talk about like more productive industry. If you could pull up that last slide, Rio Tinto, and just want to make this clear so nobody misunderstands this. Absolutely evil company, one of the nastiest mining corporations on the global scale, which is saying a lot knowing the history of that kind of that kind of industry. But even they're getting hit hard, and you can't say that people pulling out minerals and raw materials out of the earth is not real productive economic activity, right? Rio Tinto reports a 29% drop in half-year earnings as commodity prices fall. This is from the Financial Times. The industry is now facing a vicious margin squeeze as fears of a demand-sapping recession drive commodity prices lower, while the cost of everything from diesel to explosives soars, right? So when you start to see that, as Michael Roberts lays out earlier, you start to see that in the most productive sectors of the economy. That means that things are looking very, very dire for the future. And remember, this recession is coming out of a few things: supply chain crisis, the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, still the lingering effects of the COVID-19 shutdowns, and inflation, of course. But I want to up this Mick Lynch bit here, because what is going to be asked, and we're going to talk about Fed policy and what this means for everyday people in just a second. What is going to be asked is, it's time to tighten our belts. It's time for you to ask for less raise at work. It's time for you to be a little bit more subservient and a little bit rambunctious, right? It's labor discipline that we're seeing right now. And there's no better example of that than what's happening with the railway workers in the United Kingdom and the strikes in the United Kingdom. And this is Mick Lynch talking about inflation, and something that's always left out of these conversations about what is driving inflation.
I know that you mentioned, well, you said that pay wasn't the biggest part of this. You would come to the pay at the end, but it is a part of it, isn't it?
Yes.
And I mean, look, you would have heard the argument, but I want to put it to you, because there is the argument from government, there is the argument, certainly when it's come to other areas of public sector pay, that you simply cannot put up wages by the rate of inflation, because the rate of inflation is so high, and you end up in an inflationary spiral, which makes it worse for everyone, and we all live with the pain for longer. You just simply can't have 9.4% pay rises.
Why don't you mention profits and dividends in that? I mean, the only analysis we ever get from the media is that it's workers, often who are the lowest paid people in this country, are responsible for inflation. That's patently untrue in this period, because the inflation was there before the pay round, and it's been building all through the austerity and the public sector pay freeze. And there's a private sector pay freeze as well. So real wages have been in decline for many years, a decade probably.
But I mean,
So
it would be a big hike to go up to 9.4% now.
Well, we need inflation, RPI, the real measure of inflation, which they want to hide, is 11.8.
Right.
And for the 2 years that they're proposing that we go into a pay deal at the moment, it's likely that inflation would be 20% accumulative across those 2 years. Most of our people haven't had a pay rise for 2 or 3 years. If you're a nurse or a doctor or a care worker or a refuse worker, you may not have had a real terms pay rise for a decade. So it can hardly be true that it's wages that are causing inflation. It's profit taking that's causing inflation, because the big corporations are not skimming their profits down and saying, I'll do a redistribution. We actually need to support wages in this economy. And that's what we're faced with. It can't be true that low paid workers are causing inflation. The problem with low paid workers is they haven't got enough money, and it needs to be resolved through the pay packet.
I mean, I think a pretty incredible masterclass there in debunking this kind of argument that it's workers' wages that is driving up inflation, when undoubtedly it's profits. And what you're starting to see now, as I've noted in my piece on Jackman, for example, on the oil industry in Texas, is that what are they doing with most of those profits? They're shoring up their financial position and paying off people in the form of dividends, not investing into production, not investing into wages, and it's because they're hunkering down, for a down period, and that's across that's across all industry right now. So the reason that Mick Lynch bit is important, not only to sort of debunk this kind of false argument that it's workers' wages that have gone up too much in the United Kingdom and in the United States that's causing inflation, is to start to inoculate against what is coming, which is going to be demands that people basically keep their wages where they are as all the prices and the cost of living around them skyrockets. Matt, we had a pretty dark anniversary just 3 days ago, July 24th, which is the anniversary of July 24th, 2009 was the last time there was an increase in the federal minimum wage. I mean, think about how much has changed in the economy since then. Think about how much your cost of living has skyrocketed since 2009. Those workers working those wages have seen no increase despite inflation and despite, severe cost of living increases in the form of rents, etc. Right? And what we're being faced with right now are these demands that we start to accept worse conditions than we already have, which is absolutely inhumane and bullshit. So going back to like the first bit here, it's like the question of a recession. Like, what does that mean for you? Are you a GOP operative who wants to point at the economy, to try to drum up votes in the midterms? Or are you a Democratic Party stooge who wants to act like things are good when they really aren't? Or are you a business trying to plan out your yearly strategy for the rest of 2022, 2023? If you are, welcome to Left Reckoning. I hope we can introduce you to some new ideas. But no, you are a worker. You're somebody who is preparing for what looks like a very difficult period ahead. And how does inflation hit workers? It hits you in the amount of money that you have to pay from your wage, which is very likely has not raised significantly, if it's raised at all, to cover those increase in prices. Nearly 40% of consumers, according to a recent study, cannot put any money at all into savings. And as prices are going up, people are having to rely more and more on debt to survive. 43% of Americans, according to a Lending Tree study that just came out, are expected to add more debt, in the next few months. And what's happening to debt right now, Matt? It's becoming more expensive because the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates. So you're already getting squeezed so that you're unable to, buy the things that you need to get by, things that are the most direct, like food, but even, paying for transportation for yourself. If you have to buy a car and you buy it through debt because you can't afford the amount of money it costs to buy a new or used car, frankly, that's a socially necessary expense that is pushed upon you by society because we don't have public transportation in most of this country. And that means you're going to get squeezed even more. So what happens then? You have to accept worse conditions at work. It allows employers to trim the quote unquote, I hate using this language, but trim the fat, fire people from their work, sending those people into the Industrial Reserve Army, people who now are unemployed, who now have to compete against all the other unemployed people. And what does that do? It drives wages down. Every policy that we're getting from the government and the system right now is trying to lower your standard of living, lower your wages. And that's why this recession talk, it's certainly important, But you see why they have very, very different priorities in this conversation. The Democratic Party people and the Republican Party people, than you do as an American worker. So your prices are going up, debt is going up, and as a response, investment in jobs is going to go down. And Lord help us all, wage growth, alone is going to slow. And these are the weapons that they use to hit you on your head, to make you weaker, and to make you more compliant. And it's why both of these organizations, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, do not have your best interests at heart. And frankly, a lot of people who report on this stuff and talk about this stuff for a living don't either, when they try to use this kind of, nonsensical debates about, oh, well, is this officially a recession under, the NBER definition? Oh, well, they're using the false definition. It's like, yeah, there's correct answers and wrong answers to that question, but it misses the fucking point. And that's why people are so frustrated right now. And we should be looking at folks like Mick Lynch to get us, some kind of pathways and ideas about how to get out of this quagmire than people in the Biden administration.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, like, the types of conversations that the people from the commanding heights of the economy are really having would go something like, a recession might not be bad because we need bodies to throw at supply chain issues, and we need to get people to work. That's a huge preoccupation for them right now, and yeah.
Just, I don't want to open up this can of worms right now. I know y'all covered it on Majority Report. I covered it yesterday. Matt, the labor market is so good right now in the United States that there's a case of child labor being used at facilities in Alabama, right? Like, shut the fuck up, frankly.